So because your textbooks were having so many issues downloading, I wanted to walk through the chemistry of life stuff and the properties of water that you guys are going to need for your chemistry of water and properties of water lab that you're doing at home. So you should watch these videos before you complete the water lab. So to start off, all living things are made up of matter, and the most basic component of matter is the atom. So when we talked about the hierarchy of life and biological levels of organization, we talked about the atom being the most basic component of a living thing. And so all living things are made up of matter. Matter has mass, and all matter is made of atoms. So an atom is the smallest unit of matter that retains the property of that element. So elements are different components depending on how many protons, neutrons, and electrons they have. So carbon is different from hydrogen, which is different from oxygen. All of those are different elements, and one single atom of that element still has all of the properties of the element. So one atom of carbon will behave the same way as 6 atoms of carbon. So they will still have the properties of that element of carbon. All right, so in that atom, they have protons, neutrons, and electrons. Those are those subatomic particles. We're not a chemistry class, so we won't get too crazy in depth with protons, neutrons, and electrons, but it is important to understand what they are so that we can talk a little bit about how atoms interact. So a proton is what makes an atom what it is. It's that thing that determines the identity of an atom. So a carbon always has 6 protons in its nucleus, and oxygen always has 8 protons in its nucleus. So each element has a specific number of protons in its nucleus, or this middle part of the atom. So those middle parts of the atom, we have our protons. Those are going to be our little red dots here, and protons have a positive charge. So when we think about things interacting, positive and negative, we know the idea of opposites react. Positive charge is going to be inside the nucleus, inside of that middle part of the atom. The protons have a mass of 1, so with the neutrons, they help determine how much mass that atom has. Neutrons also have a mass of 1, and they are also located inside the nucleus. So our protons were the little red dots, our neutrons are going to be those little black dots. Black dots, the neutrons don't have any charge. They are not positively charged, they are not neutrally charged, they're just there and they're heavy. So you can have an atom with the same number of protons. So remember, you have to have the same number of protons for it to be that element. So you can have a carbon atom that has 6 protons, because if it had 7, it wouldn't be carbon anymore. But it can have different numbers of neutrons. That's not going to change the identity of the element. What happens instead of changing what kind of element it is, you have what's called an isotope. So an example of that would be uranium-238 and uranium-235. They still have the same number of protons that uranium always has, but uranium-238 is heavier. That 238 is how much mass it has, and uranium-235 is less heavy. The reason for that is because they have different numbers of neutrons. When we get into some later topics, we might talk about isotopes and radioactivity. That is what causes something to be radioactive. But for now, we're not too worried about isotopes. Just know that neutrons don't have any charge. All right, electrons are going to be on the outside. Those are our little blue dots on our atom here. Those are located outside of the nucleus, and they don't have any mass. So they're small enough, they're zipping around like crazy. They're doing crazy stuff outside of the nucleus, and those are negatively charged. So we had our positively charged protons inside of the nucleus, and we have our negatively charged electrons zipping around on the outside of that nucleus. Those electrons are what cause the interactions with other atoms that make the bonds with other atoms. So a bond, you can think of a bond that you have with your family or your friends. It's something that connects you guys. So a chemical bond is the same kind of thing. When something is connected by a chemical bond, when you have 2 or more atoms connected, that's going to be a compound. So you have all of your little atoms, and between them, these lines represent chemical bonds. There's lots of different kinds of chemical bonds. So covalent bonds and ionic bonds, they're going to share their electrons differently. So with a covalent bond, you have these 2 atoms, and they have these 2 electrons outside of their nucleus, and they're like, hey, you've got an electron, I've got an electron, let's put them together and share together. So this covalent bond, they are sharing these 2 electrons equally. When you have atoms connected by covalent bonds, that's when you have a molecule. I'll probably end up saying molecule when I'm talking about compounds as well. don't worry too much about the distinction between molecules and compounds until you get to chemistry later on in your school career. All right, ionic bonds, they're not sharing evenly. Covalent bonds are like, I've got one, you've got one, let's put them together, make something beautiful. Ionic bonds, those ones don't share equally. So ionic bonds, you have something that has an electron that wants to have a more stable place to live. So this one, our sodium ion over here, it's got this electron that's just kind of hanging out. Chlorine has this empty spot for an electron, and it's like, okay, we could both be more stable if you give me that electron. So sodium is going to donate that electron over to the chlorine, and that's going to connect those two atoms with an ionic bond. So covalent bonds, they're sharing evenly. Ionic bonds, this one's donating it to the other one. The last kind of bond that we're going to talk about is hydrogen bonds. These are so important for life, and in the next video when we talk about properties of water, you'll understand why. I'm going to talk about hydrogen bonds in a whole lot of different ways, but hydrogen bonds happen because not all atoms are created equal. In here, our oxygen is going to be super positive, and so it has more protons inside of its nucleus, and so it's going to attract more electrons. So that's going to take the electrons away from the hydrogen a little bit, and it's going to end up with the oxygen having a slightly negative charge and the hydrogen having a slightly positive charge. Those slightly negative oxygens are going to be attracted to the slightly positive hydrogens. They're not sharing electrons, they're not trading electrons, they're just kind of like, you're kind of positive, I'm kind of negative, let's hang out and have a weak attraction to each other. So they're not sharing anything, but they do have a weak bond together that holds them in some sort of arrangement. All right, from weakest to strongest, we have hydrogen bonds at the bottom. They're not sharing any electrons in any way, so they're pretty weak. They can be broken pretty easily. Then we have our ionic bonds. That's the one where one electron is being donated to the other atom, and then covalent bonds where they're both sharing. When they've got an equal partnership, that is going to be the most strongest bond, versus the hydrogen bond that is like, I kind of like you, you're kind of positive, I'm kind of negative. Opposites kind of attract. So that one down at the bottom is going to be the weakest. All right, that's the end of our chemistry. Our next video is going to be on properties of water.